My friends, my fellow Americans, even though we don't have a flag in the room, I'd like you to stand again and join with me in renewing our noble pledge of allegiance to it, just as if it were here. It's in our hearts after all. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Whoops. People always wonder what I carried in my hat, and it's usually a letter or two. I'd like to take a moment to express my amazement and sense of being humbled at the fact that even now, 140 years after my presidency ended, my fellow Americans are still willing to gather on a cold and rainy winter day to hear what this poor country lawyer might have to say. I'd like to start by thinking about one of those last few words in that noble promise that we all just recited, and that's the word liberty. You see, the world has never had a good definition of that word liberty, and the American people just now are much in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using that same word, we do not all mean the same thing. What constitutes the bulwark of our liberty and our independence? Surely does not merely our frowning battlements, our bristling seacoast, our mighty army and navy. These alone are not reliance against tyranny. Our reliance is in the love of liberty which God has planted in our hearts. Our defense is in the preservation of that spirit that prizes liberty as a heritage of all people, in all nations, everywhere. Destroy that spirit, and we have planted the seeds of tyranny around our very own doors. At what point then shall we expect the approach of danger to our liberty, and by what means shall we fortify ourselves against it? I answer, if destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and its finisher. It cannot come from abroad. At what point then shall we expect the approach of this danger? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step across the ocean and crush us in a single blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Africa, and Asia combined could not by force take a drink from the Ohio nor leave a track upon the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. My friends, when our nation was founded, it was founded with a government not of men, but of laws. Let therefore reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother and father to the lisping babe that prattles upon their laps. Let it be written in primers and spelling books and in almanacs. Let it be taught in the schools, in the seminaries, and in the colleges. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. And in short, let reverence for the law become the political religion of the nation. And let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay of all sexes, tongues, colors, and conditions sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. Let us strive to continue to deserve, as far as mortals may, the loving care of divine providence, trusting that in future national emergencies He will not fail to provide us the instruments of our safety and security. Let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. I was born on February the 12th, 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky. I was the middle child of 3, having an elder sister, Nancy, who died as a young woman in childbirth, and a younger brother, Thomas, who failed to live beyond infancy. Both my parents were from Virginia, of undistinguished families. I know little about my paternal grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, whose namesake I am, save that he emigrated to Kentucky from Rockingham County, Virginia, about 1781 or 2, where a year or 2 later he was killed by Indians, not in battle, but by stealth, while he was laboring to open a farm in the forest. My father, Thomas, at the death of his father, was but 8 years of age, and he grew up literally without education, never learning to do more in the way of writing than to crudely scrawl his own name. My mother, Nancy, was of a family of the name of Hanks. She died in my 8th year. 2 years later, my father married a widow woman who proved to be a good and kindly mother, of whom I have nothing but fond recollections. In my 9th year, my father removed the family from Hardin County, Kentucky, to what is now Spencer County, Indiana. There I grew up. We reached the place about the time the state came into the Union. It was a wild region then, with many bears and other wild animals still in the woods. There were some schools, so-called, but no qualification was ever required of a teacher beyond reading and writing and ciphering to the rule of 3. So, of course, when I came of age, I did not know much. If some stranger who claimed to understand Latin happened to be sojourning in the neighborhood, why, he was looked upon as a wizard. There was absolutely nothing to excite ambition to education. What little advance I now have on that meager store of knowledge I have picked up along the way under the pressure of necessity. I now think that the aggregate of my schooling does not even amount to a single year. Seeing as how we're in a library, I'd like to tell you a little story about how I learned to read. All of our reading in the ABC schools was done aloud. We lined up and read verses from the Bible. And to give you just a little bit of an example of what our schools were like, let me add this. They were sometimes called blab schools. Now I'm going to ask some of our younger folks if anybody knows what that word blab means. What does that mean, young lady? To talk. Talking schools. Well, we're going to have a little example here of what classrooms were like back in my time. We're going to divide the room up into 2 parts, this side and that side. Now, I trust everybody on this side knows their ABCs. Getting nods? Good. And I trust everybody over here can count from 1 to 10. That's good too. All right, when I say go, I want this side to start reciting ABCs. This side, count from 1 to 10. Excuse me. And do it with vigor. Are we ready? 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3, 4.
That was what our schoolroom sounded like. Any teachers here in the audience today? Does your class ever sound like that? No, good. You wouldn't want it to either. So there wasn't a whole lot of learning going on. But reading was so important. I always said that everything a person needs to know is in the books, and book learning is available to everyone. I also always said that my best friend's a man who gets me a book that I ain't read yet. In my 21st year, we removed from southern Indiana to central Illinois by ox cart. I had saved $27 and invested that money in a peddler stock of needles, pins, and other notions that I had the opportunity to sell to the families inhabiting the widely separated cabins along the way. I spent my first year in Illinois in Macon County, where I worked as a clerk in charge of a store and mill. Later removed to New Salem nearby. I held many jobs: storekeeper, flatboat operator, teacher, eventually lawyer. Wasn't too good at any of them. Shortly after I arrived in New Salem, along came the Black Hawk War, and the regular army was augmented by companies of volunteers, and the young men in New Salem and nearby Clary's Grove asked me to form a company, and I did. The men in my company elected me their captain, a success which gave me more pride and satisfaction than any I have enjoyed since. Although our company was officially designated as mounted, neither I nor any of my men had a horse. Perhaps I did not have the spirit of command within me. I recall that the response to my first direct military order was, "Go to hell, Abe." I didn't have much to do with Indians in the Black Hawk War, and as a matter of fact, the only encounter that I can recall with a live one was one night when I had to stop my men from butchering a more or less friendly one who was carrying a military pass. So it might be said that at the end of that war, there was one more Indian left alive than there would have been otherwise had I not taken up arms. I returned to New Salem at the end of the campaign. Didn't find out till later, though, that the officer who signed my discharge papers was a young lieutenant by the name of Anderson. He had risen in rank by 1861, and that spring commanded the garrison at Fort Sumter, where the Civil War actually began. I thought about what I should do. Thought about learning the law, but feared I would not be able to do so without a better education. Thought about studying the blacksmith trade. Eventually, I found an advertisement in the Springfield paper that a surveyor in town was in need of deputies. Knowing absolutely nothing about surveying, I marched the 12 miles to Springfield, presented myself, and was given several books on the subject to study. I took them home, read them, 6 weeks later returned, and pronounced myself ready for work. I added the job of postmaster to my duties as storekeeper there in New Salem. That had a double advantage. One, I got to know a lot of the people, and two, I got to read all the newspapers before I had to deliver them. I remember one time an elderly Irish gentleman asked me if I had any mail for him. And I said, "Perhaps so, sir." But I asked what your name is. And his response was, "Well, surely it'll be on the letter." In 1832, I ran for the Illinois legislature and was defeated. Was elected to that office, however, at the 3 succeeding elections. I returned to Illinois, to Central Illinois, and began my law practice. And the way I became lawyer was tied once again to a book. As a storekeeper, I had bought a barrel full of household goods from a family heading west whose wagon was overloaded. Found down in the bottom Blackstone's Commentaries, which was an indispensable cornerstone of a lawyer's education in my time. and I began to read that voluminous tome. Never in my life had my mind been so thoroughly absorbed. I read that book until I had devoured it. In 1846, I ran for the United States House of Representatives as a member of the Whig Party and was elected. Was not a candidate for re-election because that was not the custom among the Whigs at the time. Returned to Springfield and began practicing law more assiduously than before. The Missouri Compromise aroused my attention again. In 1858, I ran for the United States Senate against Judge Stephen A. Douglas and was defeated, and returned to Springfield again to my law practice. By this time, Mary and I had 4 boys, 3 were still living. And I recall one day I was walking from my office in downtown Springfield in Courthouse Square to my home a couple of blocks away, and 2 of my boys came out to meet me, as they usually did. And they clambered up on my suit, and one was hanging from my coattails, and one was perched on my shoulder, and they were both wailing at the top of their lungs. Now, since I was by this time a familiar sight on the streets of Springfield, a passerby asked me, "Mr. Lincoln, what seems to be the matter?" And I looked at him and I answered, "Exactly the same thing that's the matter with the entire world. They both want 2 walnuts and all I've got is 3. Judge Douglas defeated me in 1858, but in 1860 I was nominated by the new Republican Party at their convention in Chicago to be their candidate for president. Was elected to that office in the fall of 1860. That fall, shortly before that general election that sent me to the White House, I had been reading the results of a survey of voters in Springfield which listed them by name, together with their intentions on casting their ballots. 23 ministers of different denominations were listed, along with a great many prominent members of their congregations, and a very large majority of them was against me. These men knew well that I was for freedom in the territories, freedom everywhere as far as the Constitution and laws would permit, and that my opponent was for slavery. They knew this, and with a Bible in their hand, in the light of which human bondage cannot live for a moment, they were going to vote against me. I did not understand it at all. I know there is a God and that He hates injustice and slavery. I saw a storm a-coming and I knew His hand was in it. If He had a place and work for me, and I believed He did, I was ready. I am nothing, but the truth is everything. I know liberty is right because Christ teaches it and Christ is God. I was not at all concerned about this because we know that the Lord is always on the side of the right, but it was always my deepest care and concern that I and our nation should be on the Lord's side. I left Springfield for Washington late in the winter of 1861 for my inauguration in March. Leaving Springfield was one of the most difficult things I ever had to do. And a great many citizens of the town had gathered at the train station to see me off. I struggled to find fitting words to bid them farewell. I said, "No one not in my situation can appreciate my feelings of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of the people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century. Here I have grown from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. I leave now not knowing when or whether ever I shall return with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever accompanied him, I cannot succeed. with it, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his tender care commending you, as I trust you in your prayers will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. From Springfield, I went by train, making stops along the way, including one in Independence Hall where I stood, in Philadelphia, where I stood awestruck before Independence Hall. The closer we got to Washington, the greater the weight of the responsibility I was about to assume appeared, and the clearer it became to me. It became even clearer as I finished the text from my inaugural address, which I'd like to quote for you in part. My fellow citizens, I appear before you today in accordance with a custom as old as the government itself to take the oath of office prescribed by the Constitution to be taken by the President before he enters upon the execution of his office. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and peace and personal security are to be endangered. There never has been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. I have no intention, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. One section of the country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other section believes slavery is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. Physically, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from one another nor build an impassable wall between them, and intercourse, either amicable or hostile, must continue between them. Is it possible then to make that intercourse more advantageous or satisfactory after separation than before? Can aliens make treaties easier than friends can make laws? And what if you do finally stop fighting? After much loss on both sides and no gain on either, when you finally do, the same old questions as to terms of intercourse are once again upon you. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I ended that first inaugural with hopeful words. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the course of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Less than a month later, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The war lasted considerably longer than anyone expected. It ended up lasting almost exactly 4 years. And about halfway through, a battle was fought in and around a small town in southeastern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. The battle lasted 3 days, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, in the year of our Lord, 1863. 50,000 Americans fell dead or wounded. The blood they shed caused the creeks flowing through the battlefield to run red for weeks afterward. So horrendous was the battle, so great the sacrifice of those who fell, that a decision was made to construct a national cemetery on the battlefield site and bury the dead where they had fallen, Union soldier beside Confederate. As Commander-in-Chief, I was invited to, and if I remember the words of the telegram correctly, make a few appropriate remarks in the dedication of that cemetery. I wasn't the main speaker that day. That was Dr. Edward Everett, noted orator of the time. Dr. Everett began to speak, and speak, and speak, and speak for just about 2 hours. I was worried, because I knew my remarks would last about 2 minutes. And by the way, I don't know how this has come to happen, but I've been told that people today think I scribbled those remarks down on the back of an envelope on the train coming up from Washington to Philadelphia. Not so. I spent 3 weeks or more working on them. Don't know where that envelope thing came from. Somewhere, I don't know. Anyhow, I'd like to take a little over 2 minutes and share those remarks with you. And as I do, I'd like you to listen to them in 2 different ways. One, listen as an American living in 1863 in the middle of a civil war that is pitting brother against brother, friend against friend, even father against son. And listen as an American living 145 years later. The first method of listening can probably be best done with your ears. The second requires you add your heart to the process. My friends, my fellow Americans, I ask you to join me now at Gettysburg. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war lasted another year and a half. Finally, shortly after my second inauguration, it came to an end in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Four days after that, Mrs. Lincoln and I went to the theater. I had ended my second inaugural address with what I believe to be my vision for the war coming to an end and America coming back together. I'd like to share those last few words of the second inaugural with you. I ended by saying, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and for his orphan, and do all we can to achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. I'd like to think that that was good advice to the United States of America in 1864, 1865. I'd be humbled if it were equally good advice to the United States of America of 2008 and 2009. My friends, my fellow Americans, I thank you for your kind attention and remain, as always, your obedient servant, Abraham Lincoln.